morning, ladies and gentlemen, participants of the ASEAN Taxonomy stakeholder consultations. Our host, Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, and as well as ATB members who are also on the call. Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to provide an overview of the ASEAN Taxonomy, which we hope can assist you during this consultation process. I'd just like to check with Najwa. Najwa, are you able to share the PowerPoint on screen? If not,
yes,
I could do so. Okay, thank you.
Yes, just give me a minute, sorry.
All right.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Yep, thank you. Thanks, Najwa. So the development of the taxonomy is an iterative process, and the key concepts of the taxonomy have been elucidated in version 1, which DG Zung mentioned was published in November last year. And this version is intended to be used as the basis for discussions with officials and private sector stakeholders, the participants of this consultation in particular, in furthering the work of the taxonomy. Najwa, is it possible to have the full screen slideshow version? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So I'd like to begin by providing some background to the origins of ASEAN Sustainable Finance initiatives. The ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, which is a forum of securities regulators representing all 10 ASEAN member states, began developing its sustainable finance initiatives in 2017, and the ACMF concentrated on bonds first, specifically green bonds, and developed the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, which was launched in 2017. And following that, they also developed the ASEAN Social Bond Standards and ASEAN Sustainability Bond Standards in 2018, and these standards were based on the International Capital Market Association, or ICMA's principles for green bonds, social bonds, and sustainability bonds, but had unique features for the ASEAN region. Next slide, please. And we are pleased to say that since 2017, the issuance of bonds aligned with the ASEAN bond standards has seen steady traction, with $23.64 billion worth of bonds issued up to early May 2022. And as you can see, sustainability bonds tended to dominate, followed by green and social bonds. Next slide, please. So at the 6th ASEAN Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting in 2020, the AFMGM took note of the various sustainability or sustainable finance initiatives driven by various sectoral bodies under the finance cooperation process, and they mooted greater coordination, especially among the banking, capital markets, and insurance sectors. And by this time in 2020, 3 of these sectoral bodies, namely the ACMF, which I mentioned earlier, the Senior Level Committee on Financial Integration, short form is SLC, which covers the banking sector, as well as the Working Committee on Capital Market Development, also issued reports and roadmaps to chart ASEAN sustainable finance pathway. Next slide, please. So these reports are, as you can see on screen here, And the ACMF issued the roadmap for ASEAN sustainable capital markets on the left. The SLC issued the report on the roles of ASEAN central banks in managing climate and environment-related risks. And the WCCMD issued a report on promoting sustainable finance in ASEAN. And one thing in common throughout these reports is that there is a recommendation for the need of a common taxonomy for ASEAN in each of these publications. Next slide, please. So a bit of the basics here, and it's basically a 101 of what a taxonomy is. And a taxonomy, in the context of sustainability in general, is a guide used to identify and classify sustainable projects and economic activities. And it was felt that to promote sustainable activities and investments and drive the region's sustainable agenda, a common taxonomy for the region is crucial. And the ASEAN taxonomy has been designed to be inclusive, taking into account the diversity among the ASEAN member countries. In fact, ASEAN is the first region to develop a sustainable finance taxonomy that allows for the adoption of elements in a layered and phased manner. So this will commensurate with the readiness of individual countries in ASEAN. The taxonomy complements ASEAN countries' individual commitments to the 2015 Paris Agreement by creating a pathway and supporting an orderly transition towards sustainable ASEAN economies. So we hope that the ASEAN taxonomy will identify sustainable assets and investments, thus showcasing the array of sustainable investment opportunities within the region. So there are a number of challenges that we felt if a common taxonomy is not available. Firstly, that approach that we spoke of for the region will be fragmented. And because of this, investors to the region may be discouraged. Due diligence cost will be more. Because they have to deal with the individual standards of each country, and building investment portfolios will be difficult. And creation of the ASEAN sustainable asset class will also be hampered due to the different standards among our countries. And due to a lack of clarity, it may be difficult for businesses and investors to progress with regard to sustainability. And ASEAN may be compelled to adopt an existing international taxonomy which is designed for other economies and does not suit the needs of ASEAN, and may even be detrimental to ASEAN member states. So we felt the importance of an ASEAN taxonomy is multifold. Firstly, it provides an ASEAN voice that will be heard clearly in the international community. It consolidates efforts by the ASEAN central banks, capital market regulators, and insurance regulators, so that we have an integrated and holistic sustainable finance ecosystem in ASEAN. Provides consistency and credibility and secures global acceptance for sustainable finance in ASEAN. And it also facilitates better allocation towards of capital towards sustainability, and facilitates transition towards a sustainable ASEAN. Next slide, please, Najwa. Thank you. So the concept of transition is one of the important aspects of the ASEAN taxonomy, and it is a transition taxonomy. And in fact, the transition even prior to the work done by the ASEAN Taxonomy Board was also highlighted as an important feature in the three reports on sustainable finance that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So moving along, we'll just discuss the the entity that is responsible for the development of the ASEAN taxonomy, which is the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, or the ATB. And the ATB was formed under the auspices of the ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors. And in their joint statement for the seventh meeting in 2021, they endorsed the establishment of the ATB and also welcomed the initiative to develop the ASEAN taxonomy. And you can see the highlighted features that were mentioned by the ministers and central bank governors, in that it is meant to be the overarching guide for all ASEAN countries, and the feature of the taxonomy being a multi-tiered taxonomy that will facilitate an effective and orderly transition towards sustainability. Next slide, please. So the ASEAN finance regulators from the four sectoral bodies listed here have come together to form the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. These four bodies are the ACMF and the WCCMD, representing the capital market regulators, the SLC, representing the banking regulators, as well as the ASEAN Insurance Regulators Meeting, or AIRM, representing the insurance regulators of ASEAN. And as you can see on the rightmost column of the screen here, these four sectoral bodies nominated I think members to be on the board of the ATB. And I think what is notable is that the members of the board represent organizations from all 10 ASEAN member states, truly making it an ASEAN entity or board. Do we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So in a nutshell, the roles and responsibilities of the ATB is what you see on screen there. First and foremost, to develop, maintain, and promote the ASEAN taxonomy, and also determining the design and classification system used to develop the taxonomy, interpretation of the principles as standards issued by the taxonomy is also one of the roles of the ATB, as well as developing the market-facing strategies, including promotions and engagement with stakeholders, one of them being the session that we're attending today. Could you have the next slide, please? So moving along, I'd like to get to the version 1 of the ASEAN taxonomy, and to provide an introduction or an overview of version 1. So even prior to the publication of version 1, when the finance ministers and central bank governors endorsed the taxonomy initiative, what we came up with quite early on was the principles to develop and implement the ASEAN taxonomy, as you can see on screen here. So firstly, the taxonomy is the overarching guide for ASEAN countries, providing a common language. Secondly, it will take into account widely used taxonomies used internationally, but contextualize them to fit ASEAN needs. And the concept of interoperability is one of the considerations in developing the ASEAN taxonomy. Hence, the need, I suppose, to look at what is developing in the field of taxonomies internationally. And for the third principle, I think as has been mentioned before, the taxonomy shall be inclusive. It is meant to be a taxonomy for the whole ASEAN region, and it shall be and it must be beneficial to all ASEAN member states. The fourth principle goes towards the credibility of the taxonomy. We want it to be a credible framework, especially in the eyes of international stakeholders, and where as far as possible will be science-based. The fifth principle is that the taxonomy will be aligned with initiatives taken by the banking, capital market, and insurance sectors, or at least not be in conflict. Next slide. So as mentioned earlier, the ASEAN taxonomy is intended to be the principal reference point for sustainable projects and activities in ASEAN, and to cater for the different standards of development and economic activity throughout the 10 member states. The taxonomy has been conceived according to a multi-tiered concept, having a foundation framework which is underpinned by common principles which form the foundation of the taxonomy, and a plus standard which has subsequent tiers with more detailed metrics and thresholds. So the taxonomy could be described as having two floors under the same roof. So taking this analogy of a house, the member countries can adopt the tiers that are most suitable and appropriate for the needs of their respective financial sectors, catering to the different states of readiness within ASEAN. And if I may elaborate further, the foundation framework, as you see on the left box there, is proposed to be applicable to all ASEAN member states, stakeholders in the financial sectors, and business enterprises. The plus standard is an additional guidance and scope to further qualify and benchmark eligible green activities and investments. And for this, activity level criteria and thresholds will be set to determine if an activity is taxonomy compliant. Next slide, please. So this provides an overview of how the classification of activities are done under both the foundation framework and the plus standards. Under the foundation framework, economic activities must fulfill the taxonomy's environmental objectives and essential criteria that you see on the left part of the screen there. And this is a qualitative based assessment. Based on these objectives and criteria, an activity can be classified as either green under the foundation framework, or green FF, amber FF, or red FF. Under the plus standard, metrics and thresholds are applied to the focus and enabling sectors that you see on the bottom left right-hand side of the screen, in order to determine if an economic activity is eligible for the ASEAN taxonomy. Again, these are classified under the traffic light system of green, amber, or red under the plus standard. And the 4 environmental objectives and the 2 essential criteria that you see on the left part of the screen apply to all ASEAN member states, players in the financial sector, as well as business enterprises. The economic activity should also be assessed against relevant environmental laws instituted by the member countries as a minimum safeguard to ensure there's no contravention with local environmental regulations. And all of the environmental objectives are equally important. They consist of EO1, which is climate change mitigation, and this is the focus of version 1. Climate change adaptation, EO2, protection of healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, which is the third environmental objective. As well as the promotion of resource resilience and transition to a circular economy, which is the fourth environmental objective. And in addition to that, there are two essential criteria to help achieve the environmental objectives in the most transparent manner. The first is do no significant harm, and the second is remedial measures to transition. If you could have the next slide, please. Yes, so what you see on screen here is a single sector agnostic decision tree, which is used by the foundation framework to conduct an assessment of activities and proceed to qualify them, to classify them into one of three activities. Green foundation framework, which is which means that it clearly contributes or enables climate change mitigation. The second is amber, contributes to decarbonization where mitigation of other harm to environmental objectives is necessary, and red, which means that it does not contribute to or enable climate change mitigation. So how the decision tree works is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a qualitative based assessment. There are a series of questions for each layer, as you can see on screen there. And by going through the list, users of the taxonomy can identify how an economic activity is classified under the foundation framework, either green, amber, or red. Could we have the next slide, please, Najwa? So we move on to the plus standard, and the classification of activities under the plus standard is sector-based. Version 1 covers key sectors and activities important to achieving climate change mitigation through their own performance or enabling it for others. And so as each economic activity will have a detailed screening criteria, there was a need to identify the scope of activities to include in the taxonomy by selecting focus sectors. And to select these focus sectors, we need to decide first an industry classification to be used. And what we used was the International Standard Industrial Classification, or ISIC version, revision 4. And we use this due to its compatibility with the National Standard Industrial Classification systems used by ASEAN member states. As well as the classification codes used in other major taxonomies. So this will enable interoperability between taxonomies. ISIC was used to develop the Common Ground taxonomy, and the EU taxonomy uses NACE, which is derived from ISIC. And focus sectors which were most material were identified according to their environmental and economic importance to ASEAN. And the way we did it was based on data on greenhouse gas emissions and gross value added, or GVA. So the 6 identified focus sectors that you see there are numbered based on ranking, and they accounted for over 85% of greenhouse gas emissions and 55% of the gross value added in ASEAN. Beginning with agriculture, forestry, and fishing for ranking number 1, down to water supply, sewerage, etc. For number 6. And at the bottom of the screen there, you will see 3 enabling sectors, which were also included, as they improve the performance of other sectors and activities, while do not by themselves risk harm to environmental objectives, and are important for the decarbonization of economy. And these might not be included if only emissions, GHG emissions and GVA were considered. Could we go to the next slide, please? Yes, so the plus standard, I think as I mentioned, will comprise activity level technical screening criteria for the activities within the 6 focus sectors. And the plus standard complements the foundation framework by providing these activity level criteria. And for the approach in designing the thresholds of the plus standard, the ATB took into account the diversity of the ASEAN countries, the importance of a collective ambition for ASEAN, and also the need to incentivize transition towards sustainability. So the general guidance that applies to screening criteria and thresholds is that the thresholds should clearly define whether an activity is eligible or not, and be simple and quantifiable. It must be chosen based on scientific information wherever applicable, and the thresholds must be periodically reviewed and revised to achieve our chosen goal. So bearing all this in mind, the ATB decided on a stacked approach to develop activity level thresholds. So what this essentially means is that for each activity, agriculture, for example, there are multiple decarbonization pathways. So what this means is there could be more than one threshold that could be referenced for that activity at a single point in time, as opposed to, say, the European Union or the EU taxonomy, which only has one threshold. So the main motivation for multiple thresholds is to cater for the different starting points of entities across ASEAN undertaking a particular activity. Again, going back to the concept of the taxonomy being inclusive and useful for all ASEAN member states. So this option allows for higher emissions within a limited period, while incentivizing progression to lower emissions by having a system or mechanism where these less ambitious tiers have an expiry date after which they will no longer be applicable. So what you see on screen here is an example of that, of a 3-tier framework using the stacked approach. And if we go to the entry level tier at the topmost part of the chart, this is tier 3, and for this the threshold is less stringent, determined by agreed metrics. So for this level, for this tier, the threshold is static, which means that it will be retired at an established point in time, which will be determined in the future version of the taxonomy, after which this tier will no longer be used in that taxonomy. So for an example, if we take public transportation under the transportation and storage sector, the metric the metric and threshold could be average emissions for public transport, and the threshold set here, it could be based on, well, the threshold as a basis could be based on the average emissions, but the actual tier that is set would be better than business as usual, so that there is this clear aspiration to aim towards better emissions. So The next one is tier 2, which is the intermediate tier. It would be more stringent than tier 3, but it will still be static and retired at a future point in time. And the most ambitious tier is what you see at the bottom of the screen there, which will be aligned depending on activity with a global net zero 2050 or other targets or the Paris Agreement, and thus with other international taxonomies. So this is the most ambitious tier. And as you can see in the graphic, the threshold is not static, but is dynamic and will decline to 0 over time. So this multi-tiered approach, as I mentioned before, it differs from other taxonomies, and the ATB acknowledges that the following points are critical to ensure credibility and practicality, that the thresholds are binary science-based, subject to revisions, that they're transparent to enable investors to understand whether this aligns with the expectations of green. The retirement or the sunsetting feature, I think, is an important part, so that we encourage movement to the most ambitious tiers. And all of the tiers, regardless of level, must be better than business as usual. So we have recognized that the multiple pathways make the taxonomy more complex, may require additional efforts for users to understand. But it takes into consideration what the benefit that we feel overrides this is that it takes into consideration as I mentioned earlier, the different starting points of emissions generated by different entities for the same activity. So this will encourage near-term actions to improve emissions, rather than by having these thresholds which are closer to the current efficiencies, rather than to have an ambitious distant target which may not encourage action. Okay, next slide, please. So, so the proposed next steps following the publication of version 1, I think, as everyone here is aware, we are at the stage, we are already at that first step, which is the targeted consultation with key stakeholders, those attending today's session, among others. And we will also be engaging other international forums who are working on sustainable finance and taxonomy initiatives. The input received from this process will be used to further develop the ASEAN taxonomy, which will be rolled out in stages. So part of the phased development process will include, for the foundation framework, integration of other environmental objectives listed in the taxonomy. Version 1 focuses on climate change mitigation, and dividing guiding questions on environmental objectives and essential criteria, which will enrich the assessment of economic activities based on the decision tree. For the plus standard, we want to develop the methodology to set the thresholds for the focus sector, developing the metrics and thresholds for climate change mitigation, and incorporating other environmental objectives. And also ATB will have initiatives to raise awareness on the ASEAN taxonomy and to build capacity of regulators and market participants as well on sustainable finance. Next slide, please. So the version 1 of the taxonomy can be obtained here, and I think in your invitation email, the link to the version 1 of ASEAN taxonomy has also been included. And I'm not sure if any of you have already clicked on the survey, but the consultation process, or the written part of the consultation, is designed to help us further develop the next version of the taxonomy, and I think there are questions there based on how we wish to further develop the concepts that I think we mentioned before, the environmental objectives, setting the thresholds to the plus standards, and we hope for your views and feedback on those issues, and I think we we reached out to a very wide swath of stakeholders, including in addition to financial institutions, um, uh, participants in the real economy, companies involved in the focus sectors that we mentioned for the plus standard. So your perspective from your particular industry or sectors would be very useful to us in this regard. So that takes us to the end of my presentation.